Start up. Okay. Good evening, everybody. My name is Roger Williams, and I am your host here on History Author Talks. And I'm very pleased to have you all join us this evening. As usual, I'm very grateful that everyone joins us on our Tuesday evening shows. I've had a couple of weeks off, but I think we've got a great show for this evening. And before we start, I wanted to take the liberty of introducing our partner in history for this week. As many of my regulars know, I have a partner in history for our shows, and I have been having historic sites join us and some other venues. Well, tonight I'm taking producer's privilege, and our partner in history for tonight's show is my own 501c3. I am the co-founder of an organization called 10crucialdays.org. 10crucialdays.org is a public history heritage organization. We are a group of volunteers that give tours and lectures and staff rides of Washington Crossing and the battles of Trenton and Princeton. The 10 Crucial Days, as many of you know, are December 25th, 1776 to January 3rd, 1777, which ended at the Battle of Princeton, which is my background John Trumbull painting of the death of Mercer at the Battle of Princeton. So 10crucialdays.org is a 501c3, and we are very grateful for any donations that you might consider helping us out. As I said, we're volunteers, we don't get paid, but of course we do have expenses. I've got insurance to pay and website expenses to pay. And the whole point of 10crucialdays.org is to introduce citizens to the sites and venues of the important turning point battles of Washington Crossing, Trenton, and Princeton. So we are very pleased to be able to do this work, and we hope that you visit 10crucialdays.org and perhaps come and see the 10 Crucial Days historic area. There's so many wonderful things to see. Along with the battlefields, there's also Morven and the William Trent House. So there's a lot to do here in the Princeton, Trenton, Bucks County area. So that is our history partner in history for this evening. And I appreciate your giving me a little time. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining us. A special shout out and thanks to my compatriots of the Vermont Society of the Sons of the American Revolution. I am a member of the Vermont Society of the Sons of the American Revolution and the Vermont Society, the Daughters of the American Revolution, who are joining us tonight. We also have some members from the Empire State Society of the Sons, and I've noticed in the guest list throughout the country, we always have a number of my SAR compatriots who join us. So I thank my regulars. I thank all of the new people who have joined us. And I hope that you will be sure that you visit historyauthortalks.com. You will see the link to purchase copies of our guests, our speakers' books. And with that, I would like to first introduce our first speaker, Marie Danielle Annette Williams. No relation. That I know of. We haven't talked about it, but she is an independent historian living in upstate New York, and she received her Bachelor of Arts degree from Social Studies adolescent education from the College of St. Rose in Albany in 2014, and received her Master of Arts degree in American History from Southern New Hampshire University in Manchester, New Hampshire in 2018. She's been writing about American history since 2011 on her blog, the Half Pint Historian blog, and has contributed articles to the New York Almanac. She has her podcast, the Half Pint Historian podcast, and starting to air and has started airing episodes on Spotify and Google Podcasts last month. So she is the author of The Revolutionary War in the Adirondacks, and published by Arcadia Publishing. And I am very pleased to introduce you now to Marie Williams. Marie, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction. So, The Revolutionary War in the Adirondacks, Raids in the Wilderness, came out last year, but of course, because of COVID-19, couldn't really do any sort of book launch or anything. So this is my first real event with this book, so I'm super excited to be here. So, as we all know, the era of the American Revolution was an important period in our nation's history. After all, it was a period where blood, sweat, and tears were shed so that we could become our own sovereign nation and have the rights and freedoms that we have today. However, often we see in history that to the victor goes the spoil, one such spoil being the right to tell the story. So I chose to write my book based on the events that were going on in upstate New York after the battles of Saratoga from perspective of the British rather than the Americans, because we don't really hear about what the British were doing in New York after Saratoga. So before I get into a little bit about my book, I don't really think I need to explain that, like, the point of the battles of Saratoga, like, that everyone knows about them. But I will summarize them briefly in that the Saratoga campaign, the 1777 campaign led by Burgoyne, was supposed to utilize a three-pronged attack, which of course failed. And because of that failed campaign, what happened was the British decided that because New York was still super important because of the different waterways that we had here, like the Hudson River and the Mohawk River, they could be used for trading during the war and to move goods. They decided that New York was still a very important area that they wanted to keep control of during the war. So rather than abandoning the plan to capture New York altogether, they decided to lead a series of raids, which began in the spring of 1778 and lasted throughout the course of the war. So the point of these raids were multifaceted. They were meant for the British and Loyalist forces to capture prisoners of war, to kill or steal livestock and produce that was meant to be used for the American war effort, so that way the Americans couldn't use them. They were meant to destroy homesteads, sawmills, grist mills, and any sort of like building structure that the Americans could be used for their war effort. And just to generally create a sense of terror and lower morale for the American cause. So for the British, these raids were seen as justifiable. These raids were meant to punish the Americans for the actions previously during the war, in hopes that the Americans would see the errors in their ways and want to rejoin the British. So the first of these raids was led by Christopher Carlton. He was the nephew of Sir Guy Carlton, and Sir Guy Carlton would become the governor of Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick from 1786 to 1796. Christopher Carlton raided the areas of Crown Point, Ticonderoga, and Valcour Island before he moved south, and he raided Fort Anne, Fort Edward, Fort George, which was on Lake George, Glens Falls, Kingsbury, and Queensbury. Carlton utilized an integrated fighting force of Loyalists, British regulars, and Iroquois warriors. Sorry, that's my cat. And he utilized them in a way that they would travel around that area and they would destroy land, animals, food stores, munition stores, basically anything they could get their hands on that they thought would benefit the Americans. Carlton's raid lasted 2 years. From October 1778 was when he really picked up, even though it started in the spring, through October 1780. And they destroyed everything in their path in that area. They captured over 100 prisoners of war. And those prisoners of war would be marched to Quebec for their imprisonment. Captain John Monroe was initially part of Carlton's raids, but he received orders telling him to split off and raid areas on his own. Specifically, what he was meant to do was to gather supplies for the British and Loyalist raiding forces because they were low on supplies.
Marie, excuse me. Your audio is a little off. I'm wondering if maybe if you move a little closer to your audio, that the computer, that might help.
I'm using my cell phone.
Okay. Let's give that a try.
Okay. So Monroe's plan, when he was told to split off, was to go to Saratoga, because he heard that there were a lot of stores there that he could capture for their side. However, he received word that 2 of his scouts went missing near Ballstown, which is modern-day Ballston Spa. So he wanted to see what those rumors were about. And he also heard rumors that the people of Ballston Spa, well, modern-day Ballston Spa, had loyalists, including women and children, that were being held captive in their barracks. So Monroe, rather than going to Saratoga, went to Ballstown instead. Monroe's plan of attack against Ballstown wasn't just random chaos. He came with a plan, and his plan was to target specific individuals. One being Lieutenant Colonel James Gordon, and the other being Captain Tyrannus Collins, both of the 12th Regiment of the Albany County Militia. And the reason why Monroe wanted to target them was because Gordon was part of the Continental Congress at the time here in New York. And what he did was he was known for tracking down loyalists and imprisoning them. He would sentence New York loyalists to banishment from the colony. And should they return to New York, they would receive a death penalty without clemency. So Monroe's troops did single out Gordon and Collins. They captured them and imprisoned them in Quebec, and they attacked the other Albany County militiamen who were in the area. At the end of the raid, the entire area of Ballstown was completely devastated. The townspeople had to leave, and because of it, the Americans feared that the people in that area would turn to the British rather than stay on the American side. And the Americans felt that the people in the area would turn toward the British for protection from the raids. And as the war went on, the raids continued as well. And there are raids in the area where I'm from. I'm from the Lake George area in upstate New York. So in the mid-1760s, there were 2 brothers named Edward and Ebenezer Jessup. They were from Dutchess County, New York. They moved to Albany, and they engaged in land speculation in the Hudson Valley and Lake George regions of the southern Adirondacks. The Jessups became acquainted with Sir William Johnson, who was the superintendent of Indian Affairs at the time. And they purchased large tracts of land from Johnson and the Mohawks, which would encompass several towns in modern-day Warren and Saratoga counties in upstate New York, including the towns of Hadley, Lake Luzerne, Corinth, Athol, Thurman, Stony Creek, which is my hometown, Warrensburg, Chestertown, and Johnstown. And in those towns, they would establish mills, and they transported lumber using the Rockwell Falls waterfalls in Hadley, Luzerne, and the Hudson River. So given the Jessup's close ties with the Johnson family and the Mohawks, it's no surprise that the Jessups would side with the British. Both brothers would enlist to fight in Quebec in 1776, and they would both be active during the Saratoga Campaign in 1777. Both of them were fighting at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. In October 1778, Colonel Ebenezer Jessup led a battalion of men who acted as guides in Christopher Carlton's raid. And what he was meant to do was he had to ensure that no homestead in the area that was owned by American sympathizers went unscathed. In November 1779, his brother, Captain Edward Jessup, was named the commandant of a new corps of Rangers, which would become known as Jessup's Rangers. And they raided the areas of Queensberry, Glens Falls, Kingsbury, Fort Edward, and Fort Anne. So some of those towns I already listed previously with Carlton's raid. So some of those towns got attacked twice. In April 1783, after the official end of the war, in the Americans' favor, Jessup's Rangers were forced to disband, of course. And like many loyalists who chose not to make the oath of loyalty to the new American government, the Jessups were dispossessed of their thousands of acres of land holdings in New York. They moved to Upper Canada, and they would establish towns along the St. Lawrence River. And after those raids, we get to these larger conflicts, which would include John Johnson and Joseph Brent. John Johnson was the son of Sir William Johnson. When Sir William Johnson passed away in 1774, John received his father's title, and he became the Major General of the Tryon County Militia. As the Major General of the Tryon County Militia, Johnson carried out a series of raids in the Mohawk and Schoharie valleys, which began in the spring of 1780. In May 1780, Johnson and his forces raided Johnstown, where they captured 27 rebel militiamen. They burned 120 homesteads and other buildings. They were able to recruit 150 loyalists to their ranks as well. In October 1780, Johnson had a plan to invade Schenectady. At this time, Schenectady was a very strategic location because it was located on the Mohawk River, which was a crucial link in the line of supplies during the Revolutionary War era. The successful capture of Schenectady would be a strategic victory for the Loyalists because of that water. Johnson never made it to Schenectady, but his plan of attack was successful in a different way. His forces moved from Montreal to Oswego, down the Charlotte River, across the head of the Schoharie River. He devastated all of the settlements in that area that he came across until the Schoharie River met the Mohawk River. And then he wove a path of destruction down the Mohawk Valley towards Schenectady, but he didn't reach Schenectady itself. Around October 18th in 1780, Johnson's forces were encamped near Fort Paris in Southern Arabia. The Loyalists successfully attacked the fort. During the remaining months of 1780, Johnson's forces continued to lay waste to the Mohawk and Schoharie valleys, where they burnt down settlements as well as large quantities of grain that was intended for use by the American army. Joseph Brandt led a series of raids as well. Joseph Brandt was a Mohawk leader who also had close ties to John Johnson and Sir William Johnson. So because of those close ties, it was obvious that Brandt would side with the British as well. He grew up with the British being a very important part of his life. And Brandt made the decision to join with the British when the Six Nations as a whole were still on the fence about what to do with the revolution, whether they should join or not. So Brandt led an army of Mohawk and Seneca warriors along with Loyalist forces across New York from 1778 until the war's end. Brandt is known primarily for his actions at Cobleskill and Cherry Valley, both of which had the goal of securing provisions and an enlistment of more men for the Loyalist forces. On May 30th, 1778, Brandt moved on Colebrookskill. At the time, the town consisted of only 20 families, which is very small, and it had basically no way to defend itself. Brandt's forces burned down 10 houses and an unknown number of other buildings. He raided the farms for supplies, and any cattle that they couldn't afford to take with them, they killed. So that way the American army, when they moved in, wouldn't have the opportunity to use the cattle. On November 11th, 1778, Brandt and Captain Walter Butler would attack Cherry Valley. The area was completely devastated. The Americans sustained 44 deaths, 70 men were captured, and the village was completely destroyed without a single structure that was left standing. At the hands of the Seneca warriors, who failed to listen to Brandt and Butler, a number of non-combatants, including women and children, and loyalist supporters who Brandt considered friends, were killed. And that's why the Cherry Valley incident is known as the Cherry Valley Massacre. Brandt was able to carry out a number of raids throughout the Mohawk and Hudson Valley regions, and some historians would call Brandt's actions the burning of the valleys because of where he was and the actions he took. Brandt would continue his path of destruction, attacking the aforementioned Colebrookskill and Cherry Valley, along with German Flats, which is now Herkimer in New York. He would attack Canajoharie, Fort Plain, and Stone Arabia. The destruction that Brandt and his forces left in their path forced New Yorkers to move south out of the frontier borderlands to escape the raids. But just because the population lowered because people were leaving didn't necessarily mean that the raids ended. The raids would continue across New York during the course of the war. And the people in upstate New York would want the Continental Congress to do something. They had no way of protecting themselves. So they went to the Continental Congress, and Congress declared that an expedition would be carried out against the Loyalists and the Native attacks. So in 1779, George Washington enlisted General John Sullivan of New Hampshire with assistance from Generals James Clinton, Enoch Poor, and William Maxwell to raid the Iroquois homelands in New York. According to Washington, in a letter he wrote to General Gates, he wanted to hit the Six Nations where they would feel at the hardest by attacking their settlements, destroying their crops, and wreaking general havoc, just as the Iroquois under the British and the Loyalists had done in New York and in Pennsylvania. In a letter that was written to Sullivan, Washington explained the plan of attack, as well as the route that Sullivan should take, who was going to have command over what brigades. And he stated in the letter that Sullivan was to capture as many persons of every age and sex possible, and also stated that Sullivan should not accept any peace offers before complete and total destruction of the Iroquois homeland. So this would be known as the Sullivan Campaign, sometimes also known as the Sullivan-Clinton Campaign. And it lasted throughout 1779, with the American and Loyalist forces engaging one another at Tioga, in Newtown, which is near modern-day Elmira, New York, in an area near Schenectady, New York, and in several other locations. The Sullivan Campaign tore its way through Western New York and in the Finger Lakes region. And it was successful because it destroyed 40 villages and dispossessed the Mohawks of their land holdings that was in the state. After the American Revolution came to an official end in 1783, New York became a hostile place for former Loyalists. Loyalists who wanted to remain in New York were forced to take an oath of loyalty to the United States, but many still endured discrimination from their patriot-leaning counterparts. Many former Loyalists left New York voluntarily and made a living for themselves in Upper Canada or across the pond over in Britain. The bulk of these former Loyalists experienced first confiscation laws, which began as early as 1777. These confiscation laws criminalized dissent against the revolution and it punished the former loyalists for choosing the wrong side. In these confiscation laws, the properties that were confiscated would either be sold for profit or redistributed to the communities where those properties were. New York State built one of the strongest property seizure actions. Individuals would bring these actions to court, and usually to no avail. However, Alexander Hamilton would argue on the behalf of some of the wealthier individuals who sided with the British, arguing that the wealthier landowners, if they were to keep their property, that their wealth could help to bolster up the new economy. So those are the main talking points in my book. And
well, that's terrific, Marie. That was fantastic. So as you can see, the wilderness of the Adirondacks and the Mohawk and the Hudson Valley became pure civil war, much like what happened in the South. So I want to remind everybody that they can ask questions. The questions will be directed at me. So your questions will come to me. And after Jack Kelly does his presentation, we'll have a question and answer period. So thank you, Marie. That was terrific. All the little known actions in the Hudson and Mohawk Valleys. I now am very pleased to introduce to everybody Jack Kelly. Jack is a historian and a novelist. And I'd also like to think that Jack is also a friend. I've known Jack for a few years. He's a wonderful author. I've read all of his books. And his new book is called Valcour, the 1776 campaign that saved the cause of liberty. It tells the story of the most critical and suspense-filled campaigns of the Revolutionary War. The Wall Street Journal said that Valcour was vividly written and delivers an atmospheric blow-by-blow account. His previous book about the war, The Band of Giants, won the DAR History Medal. He lives and works in New York's Hudson Valley. And with that, I am very pleased to introduce our next guest, author Jack Kelly.
Thank you very much, Roger. I'm going to share the screen and put up a little slideshow here if I can get the technology to work. This is my book, as Roger mentioned, Valcour, the 1776 campaign that saved the cause of liberty. And I refer to this as the Battle of Valcour Island as the most important unknown battle of the Revolutionary War. And I'll give a couple of reasons for that in a few minutes. I want to start out with the geography of the situation in 1776. That summer, the British sent over the largest expeditionary army in history, and the target was a corridor that runs from Quebec down the St. Lawrence River, down a series of rivers and lakes, including the Hudson River, to New York. This was the main access to the interior of America. It was about the only path from Canada down into what were now being called the United Colonies. And in particular, it was a backdoor to New England. Once they got on the lakes or onto the Hudson River, the British could have attacked eastward into Massachusetts, Connecticut, and that's where they saw the heart of the rebellion. Their strategy was to send an army to either end of that corridor. They sent 10,000-man army to Canada and about 40,000 men down in New York City, and the Patriots also had two armies, one in the north stationed at Fort Ticonderoga, which is here, and one in New York City led by George Washington. The Patriots were aware of the strategic significance of that corridor because they'd used it the year before to invade Canada. They'd gone up starting at Ticonderoga, they'd gone up and took Montreal and went on up to Quebec City. You don't hear that much about the invasion of Canada in the history books, partly I think because it was somewhat embarrassing that the freedom-loving patriots, that their first inclination was to invade a neighboring province. But also the operation was a complete disaster. When that expeditionary army landed in Canada, the American army panicked. They retreated down the St. Lawrence, down the way they'd come, all the way back down to Fort Ticonderoga. The army that gathered there in July of 1776, just as the nation was declaring its independence, and they had left behind a lot of their supplies and arms. They were had very low morale, very little order, and in addition, they had been overcome with an epidemic of smallpox while they're in Canada. So about 5,000 men that came back from Canada, 3,000 of them had to be quarantined as ill with smallpox. And the fate of the nation that July pivoted in the north on three men. On the left, we see General Philip Schuyler. He was in overall command of the Northern Army. He was an Albany aristocrat, did not have a lot of battle experience, was chronically ill. He stayed mostly in his mansion in Albany. But he had one characteristic, that he was a genius of logistics, and he had been a businessman for many years, and he had a lot of connections. He knew how to get supplies and get particularly the nautical supplies that they would need on Lake Champlain to build a fleet to stop this British invasion. His man on the spot at Ticonderoga was General Horatio Gates, you see in the middle. Gates had plenty of military experience because he's been in the British Army for many years. But like Schuyler, really didn't have a lot of battle experience, but he was a genius of organization, and he was really more of a staff general than a fighting general. But he knew how to take that army that had been beaten so bad and restore morale, restore discipline, and handle the smallpox, and essentially get them back into fighting trim. And the man who would actually be leading the charge against the British on the right is Benedict Arnold. Arnold had virtually no military experience before the war, but he had a really uncanny intuition about strategy and tactics. And as a bonus, he had been a sea captain before the war, so he was familiar with boats and sailing, which was exactly what they needed to meet the British on Lake Champlain. While all this was going on, things were looking very bad down in New York. George Washington started out with 20,000 men in New York City. The British landed 40,000 at Staten Island. They fought a battle in August on Long Island. The Patriots were badly defeated. In September, British took over New York City. Washington just barely escaped. By October, they were up in White Plains fighting a battle. And after that, Washington continued to retreat across New Jersey. And by December, late November, was over in Pennsylvania on the other side of the Delaware River. And his 20,000 man army had shrunk down to 3,000 men. And he wrote to his brother at that point, he said, "I think the game is pretty near up." So it was interesting to me that when people think about 1776, a lot of the focus is on Washington and what was really a debacle around New York. Whereas in the North, the campaign actually succeeded, but you rarely hear about it. So what happened in the same time all that was happening in New York was there was an arms race going on. The British were building their ships in St. John's, which is on the Richelieu River above the rapids. You can't sail from the St. Lawrence into Lake Champlain, but St. John's is above the rapids, so they were able to build ships and sail right onto Lake Champlain. Americans were down here in Skeensboro, which is today called Whitehall. They were building a smaller fleet of boats, and the race was on to see who could get the most effective fleet built the quickest and get the advantage. Around about the end of August, Arnold felt that he had to take his fleet, the fleet wasn't even finished at that point, and sail up to the very top of Lake Champlain. And he even went up into the Richelieu River. And basically spent the month of September, late August into September, waiting in that the boats he had were gunboats, essentially oversized rowboats, and a couple of schooners. It was pretty hard service. It's very cold. The sailors just slept on the deck, and they kept waiting. And as I think Marie would testify, it gets pretty cold in the Adirondack area, even in September. So. Towards the end of September, he decided to pull back, and he came down here to Valcour Island, which is about halfway from where the British were in St. John's and the American post down in Ticonderoga. And that was where he decided to meet the British. And it wasn't until October 11th that the British fleet did sail down Lake Champlain. The Patriots were quite amazed when they saw it. The British had built an entire three-masted square-rig frigate, in addition to several schooners, an artillery barge, 22 gunboats. So they vastly outnumbered the Americans in terms of number of boats and their firepower. But Arnold had his fleet in this point. Valcour Island's just a little over a mile off of the New York coast, and he had a plan. The plan was that he figured they wouldn't come down the lake without the wind at their back, which happened to be true. The wind that morning on October 11th was quite brisk for the north, so he let them go past Valcour Island. He was totally hidden in this little bay. And when they got down around in this area, he sent out some of his warships out to fire at them from behind. And that provoked them to then turn around and have to approach the Americans up the bay against the wind. That was easy enough for the gunboats because they were basically these oversized rowboats, as were the American gunboats. But it was very difficult for the British sailing ships. And basically the battle then that developed that day was between a line of American gunboats and small warships and a line of British gunboats. And the British large ships were stuck out here as spectators. They couldn't tack back and forth enough to get up into that bay. So it was a 7-hour cannon duel, shooting back and forth, really hell on earth, smoke and the noise and the prospect of being obliterated by a cannonball. Ships were getting hit, people were being obliterated when they got hit by a cannonball. But the Americans were able to hold their own. Essentially, the battle was a draw. And when darkness fell, they'd used up 3/4 of their ammunition. Arnold somehow miraculously was able to sneak out in the dark because he knew the terrain, knew how close he could get to the shore, came down very as close as he could to the shore. The British had to stay back because they weren't certain where they would go aground. And he then fought another battle farther down the lake on his way back to Ticonderoga, lost some of his ships. A few of the American ships made it to Ticonderoga. Benedict Arnold took a stand farther down the lake and fought another battle 2 days later against the British large ships. It was getting beaten pretty bad, and ordered his ships to run into a cove on the Vermont side, where they went aground, and he set them on fire. And then when the fire reached what remained of their gunpowder, the boats exploded, because he didn't want it to have the British capture these warships. So he then saved his men, as many of who were still alive, and they walked out down to Crown Point and eventually to Ticonderoga. The British took Crown Point easily, and then the Americans waited, and they waited for a week and then 2 weeks, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. And the British essentially got cold feet. The commander, guy Carlton, was very aware of how cold it did get up in northern New York, and he was afraid that the lake would freeze if he attacked Ticonderoga. The lake would freeze behind him and cut off his source of supplies. So he essentially took the army and took the fleet and went back to Canada. And so where the Battle of Valcour Island was not a victory, it accomplished its purpose, which was to stop this invasion. Between that and the long delay of the summer of building the fleet on both sides. After the British left, General Gates and Benedict Arnold took 600 men and marched them all the way down to Pennsylvania to join Washington's army. Washington was trying to make a decision. We don't know what factors he considered, but the fact was that the threat from the north had been neutralized. He had these extra 600 men. And so it may have helped given him the confidence to risk his entire army on Christmas night to cross the Delaware, defeat the Hessians at Trenton, restore American morale, and really allow the country to survive for another year. And some of the men who fought at Valcour Island in October also crossed the Delaware with Washington and fought at Trenton in December. So I think the importance of the Northern Campaign, which has been very much neglected over the years, perhaps because of Benedict Arnold, I'm not sure about that, I think it still remains one of the most important campaigns of the war.
Well, thank you, Jack. That's terrific. And of course, we can surmise the importance of any of these key early battles. You know, it seems that they were all interconnected for sure. But it is fascinating to think that after the debacle of the Continentals, the American army trying to attack Quebec with Benedict Arnold having gotten wounded up there, and then Benedict Arnold turned around and was in command of this campaign on Valcour Island. Of course, it was being completely overshadowed by Washington and the main army in the New York campaign and then the 10 Crucial Days campaign. But it was a pivotal point, obviously, in Benedict Arnold's career. And Jack, I think, has done a terrific job in pointing out that had it not been for this campaign, the British could have gone right down the Hudson Valley, and at a time when the Americans were at their weakest, and severed off many of the supply lines in the Hudson Valley. So thank you both to our authors. Now we've got some questions. I have a question from the audience. Marie, Uh, Linda Wistermeyer would like to know, why did Joseph Brandt stay with the British? I mean, what was his compelling reason for continuing to fight so vigorously for the British cause?
So Joseph Brandt was connected to the Johnson family. Sir William Johnson has been involved in affairs with the Mohawks since prior to the French and Indian War in the 1750s. Sir William Johnson is, well, at least where I'm from, he's known as the man who fought. He fought at the Battle of Lake George, and he helped build Fort William Henry. Johnson was unique as far as the British go, because he tried to make friends with the native populations around here instead of enemies. And Joseph Brandt's older sister was a consort of Sir William Johnson. So they had sort of like a familial tie. So Joseph Brandt grew up with Sir William Johnson and the British, and Brandt joined the British cause during the Revolution because he felt, after already having experience with the British in the area, that the British were more likely to he felt that the British were more likely to have the backs of the Mohawks, that they would side with the Mohawks when they came to infighting, and that the British would just be beneficial.
Okay, thank you. Jack, you mentioned the boats that the Americans built down in Skenesboro. Tell us a little bit, if you would, where we can see one of these boats.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and I think some people know and some maybe don't, that one of the gunboats that the Americans had in the battle was sunk during the fighting, and it sat on the bottom of the bay there at Valcour Island for 159 years. It was brought up, salvaged in the 1930s, eventually ended up in the Smithsonian Institute, and it's the oldest existing American warship in existence. And I think one of the really poignant relics of the Revolutionary War, because this is the actual boat. It's not a replica, it's not a model. These are the guns that fired at the British. One of their guns was still loaded when they brought it up 159 years later. So it's just a very evocative relic of the fighting.
Thanks. And Marie, going back to Joseph Brandt, I mean, he's the character. I mean, he's a character in American history that a lot of people don't really know about. And there's a lot written that Brandt wasn't necessarily at a lot of the engagements. He sent the warriors out. What about the Cherry Valley Massacre? Was Brandt, does your research show that Brandt was at the Cherry Valley Massacre?
My research does show that he was there, although I don't know how active he was. But I know that afterwards he was not happy with the actions that the Mohawks and the Senecas who were there took, because a lot of the people in the Cherry Valley area were loyalists. But the Mohawks and the Senecas, for whatever reason, I don't know why, chose not to listen to Brandt or Butler, and they just attacked everyone instead of set people there.
Okay, great. Thanks. Jack, in your presentation, you talked about the American sailors. How well trained were Benedict Arnold's men as sailors, as opposed to just infantrymen or militiamen stuck on boats?
Well, it's probably a misnomer even call them sailors. the captains of the boats were experienced seamen and had been boat captains commercially or in other situations. Most of the men were drawn from the Army, and a lot of them would have been farmers before the war and just didn't know anything about sailing. So one of the tasks and one of the things that Arnold did while he was waiting up in the northern part of Lake Champlain is to try to train these guys just so that they knew the basics of which rope to pull and what, you know, which was the port side and which was the starboard side, I guess. And I was very impressed when you think about it, how effectively they operated, given that fact, given the fact that these guys they didn't know about guns on boats, they didn't know about boats at all, and yet they were able to hold their own in the fight with the British. So Arnold was discouraged as leading up to the battle that he didn't have the experienced men that he wanted, but I think they came through for him in a way that surprised him.
Yeah, that you can imagine how Arnold was actually facing experienced sailors of the Royal Navy. And here he had his own soldiers, most of whom couldn't even swim, much less figure out.
He kept writing back to General Gates, no landlubbers. Don't send me any more landlubbers. But that's all they had, so that's what they sent.
Exactly. Marie, why did you choose to focus really in your book on the Loyalists for the most part, and the Loyalist actions rather than the American actions?
This is the question I get all the time. So the reason why I chose to focus on the British was because we don't really hear much about them. As Americans, we have a very American-centric point of view when it comes to history in general. So I thought it was important that both sides of the story be told, especially with American history, with the establishment of our country. We don't hear much about New York State as a whole after the 1777 campaign. So I thought it was important to highlight the events that did continue to happen, especially since a lot of them happened in the area where I grew up. And this book was based off of one chapter of my graduate thesis. And when I was writing that, I was learning about things that I didn't know about. So I wanted to share my newfound knowledge with other people.
Excellent. Jack, we've had a question here from Bob Wong. Bob is a regular on the show and always has terrific questions. This one is a good example. What was Congress's immediate reaction to the total destruction of the American fleet at Valcour Island? This would have left the Hudson River vulnerable to invasion. And we view this as an important delay in retrospect.
Well, that is an interesting question. There were certainly people who were critical of Benedict Arnold for losing the fleet, including his second in command, David Waterbury, who had pleaded with him to retreat from the British rather than fight them at Valcour Island. But I think what the action on Lake Champlain proved was the fleet that the Americans were able to build was not worth much. You know, they did what they could. Arnold's feeling was, you have a fleet to use, you don't have it to keep, you know, to save. And if they'd saved it, the British advantage in firepower and the advantage of having a Royal Navy, sailors and so forth, would have overwhelmed the Americans whenever they wanted to come down the lake. So I don't think it was a disaster that a few people said after Valcour Island The fact that the whole campaign gave them another year to prepare was a critical factor. And the next year they hoped to hold Fort Ticonderoga, but unfortunately they were not able to. So.
And Jack, could you tell us? You mentioned we talked about the ship that's at the or boat, as it were, that's at the Smithsonian. Tell us what the name of the boat is.
Yeah, that's the Philadelphia, the gunboat Philadelphia. And one just a little interesting note is there's another one that was discovered during the 90s in the deep water of Lake Champlain called the Spitfire, an exact replica of that gunboat. And that's still sitting in the bottom. There's talk about raising it, but it's a very expensive proposition.
So now what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about what our authors are doing moving forward. Marie, can you tell us a little bit more about your blog and your podcast and how everybody in the audience can keep up with you?
Sure. So my blog started in 2011, and it was actually part of a project I had to do for a class I was taking at St. Rose. The class itself was about how to use technology in the classroom. And one of the things we had to do was write a blog that was about our topic as teachers. So for me, I was studying to be a social studies teacher. American history has always been my passion. So I wrote the blog for the class, and I got a good grade on it. And I enjoyed writing the blog so much that I just kept with it. And next month in May, it will be 10 years that I've been writing this blog. It has about 123,000 views at this point. So I get about 500 to 2,000 views a month on it. And the podcast I started last month, back in March. And that was because sometimes there are subjects in history that may not seem appropriate for my blog. My blog is tethered to the New York State Social Studies Region Standards and the New York State Common Core Standards, because as a teacher, I wanted to have the content of my blog be something that students could look up and get information from. So the podcast is just extra things that I think are interesting. So, and other people might think are interesting as well.
Excellent. And how do we get in touch?
So the website for my blog is the Half Pint Historian blog.blogspot.com. And the podcast you can listen to on Spotify or Google Podcasts. All you would have to do is go to Google and type in the Half Pint Historian podcast.
Excellent. So, and now I'm going to put my friend Jack on the spot here. I know authors always hate this question when their mind is out there promoting their current book. But Jack, what are your thoughts of where you're going next? You have some ideas?
I have many ideas, Roger, and I, as you know, the Revolutionary War, there's many fascinating angles on it. Many of those have had books written about them already. And the key, I think, is to find a subject that hasn't been thoroughly written about over the years. And that's what I'm looking for now. I have in the past gone and written books on other aspects of the American history. I wrote a book about the Erie Canal. I wrote a book about the Pullman strike. It was a railroad strike in the 1890s. But I keep coming back to the Revolution, and I'm really becoming more and more fascinated by particularly the people. So I think if I go on, I'll probably try to find an interesting character that hasn't been written about so much, and try to focus on a subject like that.
Well, that's terrific. Well, as you can all see, it's gotten dark for me. I'm actually sitting out on my deck this evening. I'm taking care of the decent weather here in central New Jersey. So I'm sorry for being in the dark with my painting in the background here. I want to thank our guests, Marie Williams and Jack Kelly, for giving us some of their time tonight. You can go to historyauthortalks.com and you will see the link for their websites and also the link to the History Author Talks bookshop. The proceeds for the History Author, when you purchase books at History Author Talks, go to the SAR Museum, and I'm sorry, the SAR Library down in Louisville, Kentucky. I also ask that people go to 10crucialdays.org and see what I'm doing with giving tours in the Trenton and Princeton area. And of course, donations are always welcome there. We have some wonderful shows coming up on History Author Talks. Next week, I'm very pleased that my friends at Brian Mack at Fort Plain is going to be hosting Holly Meyer and Mark Anderson. The show is called Oh Canada. And then we have my good friend and author, Joe Whalen, is going to be joined by Mark Galeaccio on May 11th. We're going to World War II, to the Pacific War from Guadalcanal to the surrender. Then on May 18th, we've got The War Goes South with John Freeling and John Moss and guest host Al Zambone. And then I also have a show coming up with Patrick K. O'Donnell for his new book, The Indispensables, about the 14th Massachusetts Regiment, Glover's Marbleheaders, and Don Chaumette on privateers off the New Jersey coast. And that show is on June 8th. So keep coming back to historyauthortalks.com. You can join the mailing list when you go to historyauthortalks.com. And I want to thank you all for your time and spending time with us on this Tuesday evening. Good night, everybody.